Welcome back, folks, to the last portion of the French Revolution. And this time around, we're going to be looking at stages 3 and 4, the Radical Revolution, the Reign of Terror, the Thermidorian reaction, and actually we'll also be looking at the swing back to the right, and I'll kind of wave a little bit at Napoleon in this one. When we left off, we were moving into the radical phase, and I highly recommend Snow Patrol's Fallen Empires in the background if you're listening to the Spotify playlist. Stage 3 formally begins October the 10th, 1792. And we have an actual real specific moment here, as we do with a lot of things. And one of the reasons why we go into such depth of detail with, or that I do particularly, with the French Revolution is it's analogous to so many others. And the same messiness that you get here, the deeper you dig, the worse it gets. And that's often true for revolution. Now, what happens on August the 10th is that the Jacobins will use the Paris mob to seize control of the assembly. The Jacobins were very, very good at making speeches to stir up a crowd and send them off to have the crowd do the Jacobins' dirty work. And that's exactly what happens. And they charge into the Legislative Assembly, which is now the Legislature of France. They seize control of the Assembly, and they also charge the Tuileries, where, in fact, the royal family was. This is a shot of the interior of the Assembly meeting room in Paris. This area up here where you can see this higher up is often referred to as the mountain because they sit so high up. These are the kind of core revolutionaries within the Jacobins. They are devout to the cause, and they're very difficult to slow down, as we'll see. The king is at this point completely deposed. He's no longer even a figurehead. The royal family will flee to the assembly to save their lives from the Paris mob, at which point they're going to find themselves imprisoned. This is one of the reasons why we see the escalation of the war against France to try and rescue the royal family. We now have a new legislature called the National Convention beginning in August of 1792. It's going to include a lot of the former members of the Legislative Assembly, but not all, because we've gotten rid of anybody who could possibly disagree with us, but it does include almost all of the Jacobins. There will be a call for elections, which is more than what we've had before, but really this is going to be very much under control of the Jacobin political party. And they're going to be in control for the next 3 years in one form or fashion or another. Following the seizure of the legislature and the fall of the royal family, there's going to be violence that occurs in the streets of Paris and eventually spread to the countryside, but primarily located in the streets of Paris. And we call these the September Massacres. September Massacres are a particularly nasty little piece of business. In about 4 days, they're going to kill at least 1,200 people. Now, those are the ones who are going to be killed in trials. Notice the quotation marks in my fingers, people. These are mob trials where we drag somebody out into the mob and say, is he guilty? And they go, yes, yes, he is. And then they march him off and kill him if they don't tear him apart in the streets right there, which often happens. There's going to be a lot of rapes. There's going to be a lot of pillaging. There's going to be a lot of street murders and lynchings that are never really accounted for. One of the kind of moments that illustrates how horrifyingly bad it's getting is what happens to the Princess Marie-Louise of Savoy. She's also known as the Princess de Lamballe, which is her married name. Where is she? There she is. She is, in fact, a lady in waiting of and close friend of Marie Antoinette. She is seized by the Paris mob. She is gang raped in the streets of Paris. This is not going to be a pretty picture. And the Paris mob has been stirred up, and they do what mobs do. Unfortunately, they riot in the streets of Paris. But it doesn't stop with the gang rape. Fortunately for her, they cut off her breasts, stuffed them in her mouth, and then cut off her head and put it on a pole and march it past Marie Antoinette's window. The guards take pity on the former Queen of France and shut the shutters so that she cannot see what's happened. And really, the sleep of reason has bred monsters. The terror has begun. Robespierre is going to refer to terror as justice. Terror isn't justice. Terror is just fear and ruthlessness and murder. It's not actually justice. Justice requires evenness and consideration. This is not that. This is mob rule. Don't tell Robespierre. The first French Republic is declared in September of 25th, 1792. This is going to be an important date for a lot of reasons. It's going to mark the first French Republic. France is now on their fifth republic. This first French Republic will last until Napoleon. We're going to see a couple of others. The fourth Republic will be formed after World War II. It will fall in the 1960s, and the current republic will be formed at that point. There will be a constitution for the first French Republic. It's written pretty early on. However, it's never used. It's going to simply be written out, just ignored by the Jacobins and others in the National Convention, who, quite frankly, are more interested in saving the revolution than actually creating reform and stability for France. They declare a state of emergency to save the revolution. The Republic is created in this moment. Now, quite frankly, the Republic is not a bad idea. It's the saving the revolution that's the problem. There are going to be a number of reforms under this first French Republic that are going to be very useful. One of which is going to be the metric system, solved one of the problems of pre-revolutionary France, which was the fact that they didn't have any sort of uniform system of weights and measures, something that the English had since the 1100s, really, formed and completely formulated by the 1200s, that you had a uniform system of weights and measures. It's actually in our Constitution, in Article 1, that's one of the jobs of Congress, is to set a uniform system of weights and measures so that a gallon is a gallon is a gallon. But France didn't have that. And so the metric system is a really pretty good piece of legislation. They do create universal male suffrage. Women will not be given the right to vote at this point, much to the distress of many of the female French revolutionaries, like Olympia de Gouges, who's going to write the Declaration of the Rights of Citizeness and Women for France, and is eventually going to go to the guillotine because of her beliefs. Women will be given the right to vote in France finally in 1944, after France is liberated from the Nazis in the Second World War. Office holding is based on tax payments. You have to own a certain amount of property and have paid so many taxes in order to hold office in France under this new constitution. There will also be a significant de-Christianization of France. Most of the Jacobins are not practicing Catholics in any way, shape, or form. Many of them are not even deists. They're closer to atheists. In fact, they're going to completely take away record keeping away from the church for matters of marriages and births and deaths, and which is one of the reasons why record keeping kind of falls into disarray for a while in France. They're going to make divorce possible. They are going to eventually close the churches entirely in France. Now, you can put a star by that. That's not on the slide there, but you need to make certain that you understand that they're going to close the churches down, which is actually going to really upset a lot of France who are very much still religious, still Catholic, and most of that's the peasants. And if you remember from what we talked about the third estates, 80% of France is peasants, and I'd say probably 80 to 90% of the peasants are still devout Catholics. And so this is going to really upset them in a lot of ways. They're also going to redo the calendar. The calendar will be adopted in 1793. They'll put September of 1792 as the very first year. That's the beginning of the republic, so that's year one. And we're going to see new constitutions written as the Constitution of the year 5, Constitution of the year 8. It will only last until 1805, when it's going to be abolished by Napoleon. They rename the months after various things. They create a 10-day week. The months are going to be called things like the month of heat, which in France comes out Thermidor, or the month of wind, which is fructidor, in the month of fruit, which is fructidor, and we get Brumiere and these sorts of names for the months. This is one attempt to publicize the calendar. You see the revolutionary little hat that the symbol for France has, and she's teaching the new children the new revolutionary way. And we have this new cult of the supreme being with the Jacobins prancing around in togas like some sort of Roman pagans in Paris. It doesn't really catch on, and neither does the calendar. But another portion of this is getting rid of the revolutionary enemies. Enemies of the revolution must be disposed of. And the clearest enemy of the revolution has to be the monarch, who's no longer going to be referred to the monarch or as Louis XVI, but as Louis Capet, enemy of France. And he is going to be convicted in a show trial and sent to the guillotine. Blew down the doors to let me in, shattered windows and the sound of drums. People couldn't believe what I'd become. Revolutionaries wait for my head on a silver plate, just a puppet on a lonely string. Oh, who would ever want to be king? The reality is that Louis is the first, not going to be the first to go to the guillotine. It won't be the last. And he's certainly not going to be the last that this song applies to in terms of who would ever want to be king. Louis may have liked being king early on, but certainly not in the midst of this revolution. He will go to the guillotine well, not as well as Charles I. He's going to go crying. If you have to go to get executed, I'd go like Charles I, who goes forgiving his enemies with his head held high. Louis XVI dies as incompetently as, in fact, others. Now, one of the things to note here is the guillotine. The guillotine was also a reform of the Republic. It's designed to be an enlightened form of execution, supposed to be painless to the victim and to kill one quickly. Unlike execution by an axe, which in fact took 2 or 3 blows sometimes, if the axe was dull, this is not supposed to have done that. But it instead is going to be supposed to be a quick and painless method. Other later experimentation by a scientist who goes to be executed is going to prove that he still had some level of consciousness even after they chop off his head. He does this by blinking as many times as possible after he's executed, and he has a really good friend in the crowd who counts the blinks. The guillotine will remain even after the revolution is over as the method of execution in France. France uses the guillotine last in 1978, but after that they abolished the death penalty, but they never adopt lethal injection. It's always going to be the guillotine. Okay. The Radical Revolution is going to go into some new phases. And the next phase is going to be considered to be the Republic of Virtue. The Republic of Virtue was declared in June of 1793, about 6 months after the death of Louis XVI at the guillotine. And the point of the Republic of Virtue was that everybody needed to be devoted to the revolution and to be virtuous. Now, the trouble is, who's determining what is virtuous? Virtuous does not mean that you are not willing to commit acts of violence. It doesn't mean kindness. It doesn't mean honesty. It means, are you willing to be devoted to the revolution? And who decides that? Well, those in charge, and quite frankly, your neighbors who may or may not like you. Um, 3 men will eventually be in charge of this new radical Republic of Virtue that you see here. Georges Danton is this gentleman over here on the left-hand side of your screen, I think. Georges Danton is a speech maker. He's an orator. He's going to be the one who helps stir up the crowd um, in the riots of 1792. Jean-Paul Marat is also going to be instrumental in that process. He's a newspaper publisher, and he publishes lots of articles about what the Jacobins want done and help sway their readership to the Jacobin point of view. And the last one here is in the striped coat is Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre is going to be known as the incorruptible. He's the most devout, the most devoted to the revolution, which means he's willing to do anything to preserve the revolution, not necessarily stability or reform or equality for all of those in France. He is going to be really the second person that this business of who had the great rise and great fall that you see in Coldplay's Viva la Vida can apply to. The Jacobins will center power. They hold the National Convention, and the mountain holds the Jacobins, and the 3 men who hold the mountain are the ones you just saw, Robespierre, Danton, and Marat. Well, they create 3 committees that basically control the National Convention and thereby control France. The first of these is the Committee of Public Safety, which sounds like this is the people who are in charge of the police. That's not true. The Committee of Public Safety is the executive committee for France. It's a 12-man council, has supreme authority, and within that, Robespierre himself has supreme authority. They refer to one another as citizen, but the reality is Robespierre is as much of a tyrant in his way as Louis XVI ever was, and quite frankly, more so, because he's got more authority and more power than Louis did. The Committee of General Security was appointed to fight the war. This is a wider committee and involves people being in charge of things like supplies and war efforts and other things. Then you have the Revolutionary Tribunals, and their job was to ensure citizen loyalty. These are ad hoc trials with people in charge who have absolutely no judicial or legal training at all and who are making it up as they go along. They're called tribunals because we don't give them the honor of calling them courts because they weren't that fair. One was presumed guilty. There were no rules of court procedure other than you really didn't have a chance to defend yourself much. And often, if you got brought in, there was a presumption, like I said, of guilt. Now, the Reign of Terror is going to be part of the period of the Republic of Virtue, but it has a very specific beginning. Now, once we're into the period of the Republic, we're already using the guillotine. We're already executing all enemies of the Republic. We see that with the execution of Louis XVI. But he's not technically part of the Reign of Terror. That actually begins a little bit later, in July of 1793. When kind of a paranoid frenzy will seize the Jacobins, and particularly Robespierre. And it begins with the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, who's assassinated in his bathtub by his mistress. The painting that you see here is done by Jacques L. David. David is also spelled David, but pronounced David because he's French. Is going to be very much an Enlightenment painter. He has one very heroic theme to his paintings, and it's very clear with a focal point, and lots of pathos in turning Marat into this tragic martyr. And obviously, if they can get to Jean-Paul Marat, they can get to anybody, and the enemies of the revolution are everywhere, and paranoid panic and executions begin. By December of 1793, Robespierre sees enemies everywhere. He is going to execute even Georges Danton, who kind of thinks Robespierre might be going a little too far. But at this point, any sort of criticism, any sort of criticism of those in power, of the government, that, maybe we need to be a little bit more fair, maybe we need more procedure, any kind of rational criticism means that you're an enemy of the republic and an enemy of the revolution. And all of those Enlightenment principles have gone out the window because there's no kind of check on behavior. 3 primary laws will be passed by the National Convention that will drive the terror. And what I mean by that is that if you violated any of these things, you could be declared an enemy of the republic, an enemy of the revolution, and therefore executed. The first of these is the Law of Maxims. Law of Maxims was created in April 1793, before the terror begins, which was designed to create wage and price controls to try and deal with some of the financial issues that had gotten them into this. It's an artificial system of wage and price controls, but it does help in some ways. The second was what was known as the levy en masse. The levy en masse had to deal with the fighting of the war. They are trying to mobilize all of the resources of France. France has a very wealthy country at the beginning of the revolution, but they have a bankrupt government. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to confiscate anything we need for the war effort. And if you don't like that we just took your prize stallion for the war effort, obviously you're an enemy of the revolution, and we're going to send you the Madame la Guillotine to have a date. If you object to serving in the army because you're old and feeble, so what? You're an enemy of the revolution. Have an introduction to Madame la Guillotine. That's conscription. Conscription is being drafted into the army. And censorship of anything and everything that doesn't agree with the revolution, or not so much the revolution, really, because the revolution was supposed to be about creating a fairer society for France. Liberty, fraternity, equality. But it's not equal quality when only the opinions of one group, the Jacobins, are really being listened to. It's not really freedom when you don't have freedom of speech. So, like I said, the sleep of reason has bred monsters. We have gotten the reign of terror is supposed to be saving the revolution, but what it does is create chaos and terror, and a terror state, a state based on fear. It's a police state. The third law is the law of suspects, which allowed for easy arrest. You only had to be accused by one other person who just simply doesn't like you. And if this sounds like some of what we heard happening in the midst of the witch trials, that's because there's a lot of similarity here, okay? And as I mentioned, they're assumed guilty. Any violation or objection to policy made you an enemy of the republic, an enemy of the revolution. Within 1 year, we are going to be able to specifically say that there were at least 16,594 guillotined, at least 2,600 in Paris alone. That's the ones we can verify. That doesn't include those lynched in the streets, the ease of violence that's not going to be stopped. There's not a sense of objecting to criminal activity unless it's black market. Okay, or not, in fact, objecting to conscription. Okay, there's not a sense of violence not being okay, and there's not a sense of bringing people up on charges for murder, or rape or pillage or those sorts of things, because if you're doing it in the name of the revolution, have at it. Most scholars estimate there was at least another 25,000 beyond the official numbers killed. Both men and women. About 60% of everybody was peasants and workers who were killed. A lot of the nobility has already fled. The nobility only make up somewhere between 6 to 10% of those killed during the Reign of Terror at the most. And then so the rest of them are middle class, bourgeoisie. Peasants and workers were more likely to be executed than anybody else. This is not about the nobility. It's about sheer terror. It's also about attacks on the church and anybody who might have thought that a monarchy wasn't all that bad. And one in particular nasty little piece of business that kind of illustrates the problem is what happens in the area of Nantes. Nantes was known as a Protestant stronghold, for a long period of time. They objected to a lot of the religious ideas of the revolutionaries. And we're going to have an episode known as the Drownings at Nantes that happens over the months of the winter of 1793 to 1794. And what's going to happen here in Nantes is we're going to have people kidnapped from their homes in the middle of the night, tied together, whole families, then tied onto rafts, and then the rafts will be sunk in the middle of the river. There are between 7 and 11 mass drownings. At least 7. Some scholars think there were at least 11. So you get some debate there. But we do have verifying. This is not a really well-documented piece of history because obviously this is being done in the dark. So it's difficult to estimate the numbers. No more than about 9,000. Most scholars say there's probably around 6,000 or 7,000 people killed. It's a really nasty piece of business. And this is why those numbers of the unverified killings, not just the guillotine, but elsewhere. Most of these people were religious and rejected the cult of the supreme being, and the revolutionaries who had moved into this area are going to go after them. We're also going to see genocide perpetrated on the citizens of the Vendée in the same area for, once again, being ones who were a little more loyal to the king than they were this newfangled revolution. And what you see up here in the top, and you're going, what in the world's going on in that particular painting? This is what is known as a Republican marriage. It's another really nasty piece of business. It's part of what goes on in Nantes and in the Vendée. Priests and monks and nuns who would not take oaths or renounce their callings to serve the Lord will be stripped naked in the middle of town, beaten, and then tied together. And what would be called by the revolutionaries a Republican marriage, because obviously you shouldn't have any kind of dignity left if you were still one of these crazy religious people. And they're stripped naked, tied together, and then thrown in the river to be drowned. Again, a lot of those who die in the Vendée and in Nantes will be declared martyrs of the faith by the Catholic Church. You can only do so much of this. I can only talk about so much of this. And it's difficult for historians who write on this sort of thing. When we look at some of the atrocities of the Holocaust or of what happens under the Japanese in China during the Second World War, it's a really difficult thing to write about because it's the very worst of humanity. In fact, one of the best works on the rape of Nanking that's done by the Japanese in Nanking, China in 1937, the woman who wrote it committed suicide because it's just a brutal, brutal event. And that's actually analogous to what happens in the midst of revolution, is that the public can only take this for so long before it's like, we have to do something to stop this. And that something is going to be called the Thermidorian reaction. It happens in July of 1794. Please notice that all of these revolutions happen in July. Why do they happen in July? Because it's hot and people are more irritable. In the winter, you don't usually get lots of revolutions, honestly, unless you're in Russia. Revolutions happen in the winter time, usually only in Russia, because they're used to it. The rest of the world, they tend to be in the hotter months of the year. The Thermidorian reaction is so called because July has now become the month of Thermidor. And what happens is a swing back to the right, a basically revolution from within. Rises up, and they've had enough. The terror has gone too far. You are executing people willy-nilly. You've executed 25,000 people. This is ridiculous. And so you're going to have some moderates who seize control of the National Convention, and by stealth and surreptition actually manage to arrest Robespierre. They move quickly to execute him. It was a wicked and wild wind, and once again, he's fallen from grace. People couldn't believe what I'd become. Revolutionaries wait for my head. Now, Robespierre hasn't been king, but he's certainly been the only guy in charge, even if he doesn't have that title. And the reality is that he has created a situation where he's the only man there, and now they're going to remove him. The execution of Robespierre is a really interesting kind of thing because not only does it show that the people of France have had enough, but you'll notice when you look at this painting versus the one that I showed you a minute ago of the execution of Louis XVI, the reality is that you just don't see as many people. Now, certainly there's some cheering going on over here. Even the dog seems to be rather elated. But there's not as many people here. It's a pretty limited bunch because, well, one, the crowds of the revolution have thinned out a bit because you've been executing people, but also because this is the end and we're tired of it. We're tired. And so we switch back to the bourgeoisie or the middle class republic, which will last for a year. It's rather corrupt and unstable. It doesn't seem to have much of a direction, and it's going to be displaced by another coup d'etat, another seizure of the state. That's the reason why, which is what coup d'etat means in French. That one will be replaced by the directorate. Once again, kind of a more middle of the road. This is a 5-man committee who's going to try and run the government. And they're going to try, most of these guys are bankers and they're trying to be much more middle of the road. But they too are in for some challenges to their authority basically within about a year. But they last, you'll notice, until 1799. But the reason they last is a really dangerous one. Now, part of the reason they last is because, unlike the middle class republic, the directorate reopens the churches. This wins them lots of friends, okay? That close the Jacobin Club and disperse it. And if you're a member of the Jacobins, you're no longer allowed to hold power. That's also a really good thing. One of the members of the directorate is, in fact, Talleyrand, who's still around, still with his head on his shoulders, which is saying a lot in this period. But they're also still at war with the Second Coalition, which includes not only Austria and Prussia, but Great Britain and Russia and Spain. And so there's a great deal of turmoil still in France. There's an attempted coup against the Directory in 1796. And once again, it looks like we're about to change governments and have a new constitution again. And as the mob is pounding at the door and beginning to gather outside the Directorate's meeting place, one of the things that we see is a young lieutenant appear on the scene. They're not sure what to do, and this young lieutenant who's guarding the door says, well, give them a whiff of grape shot and they'll go home. Well, that young lieutenant is none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. He's a young man who understands the artillery, and he said grape shot was this kind of mixture of metals that you loaded into a cannon. It wasn't a cannonball, but it was kind of like shrapnel that would go everywhere. And he's like, just fire this over their heads, they'll go home. The Directorate look at one another and they said, do it. And he does, and they go home. But the trouble is that the crowd is not dispersed because of the moral credibility or the gravitas or the political authority of the government. They've done it because they've had a cannon fired at them. And so the government's very much dependent upon the army. And that's in a dangerous place to be, where you don't have enough moral authority to get people to go home without gunfire and cannon fire. So where is it going next after this really disturbing moment? Well, that's where this gentleman here comes in. Not Napoleon, but Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was an Anglo-Irish statesman. He had been in favor of the American Revolution. But when the French Revolution occurs, he writes a letter in response to some inquiries from a friend called Reflections on the Revolution in France. He writes this in 1790, before the revolution turns radical. And Burke says, well, where it's going to go is that there's going to be a young man who possesses this true spirit of command, who understands the military. He will draw all eyes unto himself, which is what just happened with the Directory. This Corsican, this Frenchman, out of nowhere. And Burke says at that moment that the man who commands your military is the man who is master of your king, master of your assembly, and master of your whole republic. He's not wrong, because very, very shortly, Napoleon, who here's saying bye to his wife and child to go off and campaign in Italy, is going to be the leader of all of France, because now they become dependent upon the army, just like what had happened to Parliament in the time of Cromwell. Burke was right. Burke predicts the terror. He predicts Napoleon. He doesn't know Napoleon's name, but he sure does know what Napoleon's going to do. And that's the end of this lecture, folks. And I hope you have a good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Rise when I get